Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you, wherever you happen to be. I'm Hava Tirosh-Samuelson. I'm Regents Professor of History, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and Director of Jewish Studies here at TSU. And if you joined us before, you know the Jewish Studies at TSU offers a BA degree and certificate in Jewish Studies. We also have graduate courses and degrees in MA or PhD level that are done primarily through the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. But in addition to this, we have become quite known nationally and internationally because of our very robust outreach program of lectures, lecture series, conferences, workshops, exhibits, and so forth. And we have covered in those lectures history, religion, philosophy, literature, science, art, and more. Most recently, that is February 25th, 26th, we hosted a conference of the Judaism, Science, and Medicine group, and that focused on biotechnology, Judaism, and the future of humanity. And shortly thereafter, on March 11th, we hosted Professor Arnold Eisen of Jewish Theological Seminary in New York for two public lectures, one on religion and science in Judaism, and the other one on the challenges that American Jewry is facing today. So usually, if you've been with us before, you know that I introduce the speaker or the speakers, and then I set out some of the issues that will concern us in a particular evening. But tonight I am the speaker, so I will tell you a little bit about myself, as that will be part of the presentation. And the focus of the presentation, as you know, we have it on the screen, is Jewish philosophy and the challenges of modernity. So this is actually an overview. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview today. And in the fall, in late October and early November, we're going to have three lectures that are going to take three individual thinkers and kind of get deeper into some of the issues that I will raise tonight. So tonight, the lecture is quite how shall I put it? It covers a lot of material, and the PowerPoint is going to help us to go through this and make it all quite understandable. This lecture is actually a product of a course that I'm teaching this very semester. I'll have to say more about that in a minute. But I hope that some of my students here are also on this call. And this is going to be quite different from the kind of presentations that you've seen so far. So let us start. This is the outline of the lecture for tonight. The introduction, as you can see, I'll tell you a little bit more about my work on Jewish philosophy. Then I'm going to speak about how do we define Jewish philosophy, the complexity of definition, the problem of periodization, namely when do we start, the problem of the content, that's basically about who is in and who is out, how do we figure out it's also connected to the problem of definition. And then I will say a few words about leading modern Jewish philosophers, and I will conclude by just reflecting on why it matters, why we should talk about it. So a little bit about myself. As you know, you can hear it in my accent. I was born in Israel in a kibbutz Afikim. My training was at the Hebrew University for the PhD and most of my BA, but actually I didn't put it on here, but my BA is actually from SUNY in Stony Brook in 1973. But how I got to finish my BA there, that's another story, not so important. The point here, I'm a product of the Hebrew University. My academic career, you can see, has been in several universities. Most of the time, though, I should say, quarter century, really has been at Arizona State University, but I didn't start here. Started Hebrew in college, then Columbia University, then Emory and Indiana, and finally here. And I gave you a few of my books that are really only about Jewish philosophy. I also write about other areas. primarily about Judaism and ecology, or religion and ecology. I write on other topics as well, especially what has to do with science and religion, focusing on particular phenomenon of transhumanism. But if I go to this slide, you will see here, this is my first book, which actually received the award of the Hebrew University for the best book in 1991. And it focuses on an Italian Jewish thinker, David Ben Yehuda Messer Leon. And I'm trying to figure out kind of what does it mean for him to be both a person who came out of the medieval scholastic tradition and then was very open to Renaissance tradition, a very interesting character who was both a philosopher and a Kabbalist, and how does it all work and how it fits into his very complex life in which he was forced to leave Italy, ended up in the Ottoman Empire. So it was a very colorful and interesting character, and I can tell you more about it if it's interesting. My second book was a theme. I took one theme and kind of took it all the way from the very beginning, namely the biblical text, all the way to Spinoza. So it really covers how Jews thought about happiness and what happiness means for Jews and what happiness means in Judaism, and how this conversation really went through from antiquity to the 17th century. This book actually focuses, as you can see from the title, on gender and what is the role of women, actually, where do women fit into the story of Jewish philosophy? And this came out of a conference that I did here at ASU in 2001. And this book came out in 2004. The book here, my students just saw that very book because I showed it in class. That focuses on one Jewish thinker, Hans Jonas. I will get to say a few words about him toward the end, but it's also a book that came out of a conference that I did here at ASU in 2005. The book came out in 2008. And it really showcases one of the most influential thinkers in the 20th century, and that's Hans Jonas. This book, Jewish Philosophy for the 21st Century, Personal Reflections, that was edited together with my protege from Indiana University, that's Aaron Hughes. And we also came out of we did a conference actually, this was not a conference. We invited individual people to reflect on what it means to be a Jewish philosopher today and how Jewish philosophy should be written and what it could be written about. So that came in 2014. And this book is the last book of this Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers. And this book came out of another conference that I did here at ASU in 2016, but the book came out in 2018. So just to showcase kind of what does it mean for me to be engaged in Jewish philosophy. This is my co-editor of the Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers. He's my graduate students he's no longer a graduate student. A long time ago, he became a full professor. He's at Rochester University, and we've done all that work, the 21 volumes of the library, we've done that together, and the other book on Jewish philosophers and kind of personal reflections. So and this is kind of the books of the library, all kind of showcased in one place. All right, so this is just to tell you how I think that obviously Jewish philosophy is something that matters a lot, or at least should matter a lot, and that's my effort to bring it to the attention of a lot of people. So this semester, I'm teaching this course on modern Jewish philosophy, and you can see the goals I'm trying to accomplish is actually to share knowledge about Jewish philosophy and to show the richness of Jewish intellectual life, because most people kind of don't normally read philosophy or about philosophy. It's not something that is so readily available, but I think that it should be known to students. And I'll tell you in a minute how I approach this, but I think that this material really is something that all students in the humanities should be exposed to, rather than I think that it doesn't exist or it's not interesting. So I try to explain the contribution of Jewish philosophers to to Western philosophy. And indeed, I would argue definitely in the 20th century, there's just simply no way to talk about Jewish philosophy, sorry, no way to talk about Western philosophy without mentioning Jews, Judaism, Jewishness, and all the complexities of Jewish life. Of course, the Holocaust will be featuring very prominently in that regard. I also present Jewish philosophy, at least in some cases, or Jewish philosophers as critics, or Jewish philosophy as a critique of and as an alternative to modern philosophy. So people like Rosenzweig or people like Buber, names that most people are familiar with, will be an example of how the Jewish philosopher engage Western philosophy critically. The goal of the course is also to highlight certain concerns. What are the particular concerns of modern Jewish philosophy or for philosophers? And then to ponder the importance of Jewish philosophy for Jewish self-understanding. Why do we need Jewish philosophy? Who cares? To whom does it matter? Okay, those are the kind of questions that obviously this kind of course handles, or at least tries to wrestle with. So the position that I take, or the approach that I take, I define myself more as an intellectual historian. So I take the approach of intellectual history. I always situate everything in context. So I don't think that Jewish philosophy can be understood outside of context. I look at it as a cultural product. Jewish philosophy is always a product of particular time, particular place, particular intellectual climate. And that's why I'm always an historian, even though I'm dealing with philosophical ideas. My approach is also cross-cultural, because Jews always engaged non-Jews, non-Jewish thinkers, non-Jewish texts, non-Jewish modes of thought as part of the conversation between Judaism, or between Jewish culture and the surrounding cultures. So that's always cross-cultural. So in the Middle Ages, for example, there's no way to talk about Jewish philosophy without talking about Islamic philosophy, or by the same token about Greek philosophy. In the modern period, the same thing. Everything that happens always happens in conversation with the culture at large. The approach is also interdisciplinary, because I don't think that we can understand Jewish philosophy without paying attention to other forms of Jewish self-expression, such as halakha, or jurisprudence, or exegesis, or mysticism. That's the Kabbalah, the tradition of Kabbalah, about which I write quite a lot, but also other larger projects such as what we call science, or even the arts. So I think that this interdisciplinarity is very much something that always was part of my work. That's why my dissertation began actually with a person who was both a philosopher and a mystic or Kabbalist, but also a person who had a lot to say about Jewish law, a lot to say about biblical interpretation, and so forth. So interdisciplinarity is crucial. My more controversial position would be to take a personal. Sorry about that, the microphone fell. So my personal approach is, the next point, they're looking at the philosopher as a person first and foremost, and kind of highlighting the biography of the philosopher. That, I think, is very characteristic of the fact that I am an intellectual historian. I don't think that philosophy is introduced just by ideas talking to ideas. Rather, it's always a human being who lives in a particular time and place, has a particular kind of education, relates to specific people, and out of that very concrete particular context of personal life out of that emerges a philosophy, or set of ideas, or set of concerns. So I always tell the story of Jewish philosophy through the philosophers, not just through just ideas or just texts. And finally, this approach, of course, it's always historical, because it focuses on change over time. So there are always specific issues that the Jewish thinker interacted with, responded to, wrestled with. Okay, we can't do it outside of the historical context. So if you look at it historically, why should Jewish philosophy matter to us? So I'll start by looking kind of again, as an historian, as a intellectual historian or cultural historian, why bother with this? And the answer is Jews thought about what it means to be Jewish through philosophy as only one form of self-expression. I give you the other forms of self-expressions as it came also in the previous slide. So if you cannot talk about Jewish culture or the Jewish experience or Jewish history and be oblivious to or kind of indifferent to philosophy. Philosophy is very important venue of Jewish self-expression. A distinctive intellectual philosophy is also a distinctive form of an intellectual discourse within the Jewish culture. There are specific texts that we can recognize as Jewish philosophical texts. Maybe the most important text for most people will be The Guide of the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. There are many, many more philosophical texts that are important, but clearly it's a particular way of thinking about the meaning of being Jewish. Why is it so specific? Because it uses philosophical categories. So philosophical language, philosophical conversations, or philosophical problems are different, let's say, in what we're going to find in Kabbalah or in what we're going to find when we think about Jewish liturgy, about the prayer book. The prayer book actually has a lot of philosophy in it, but it's not, the prayer book is not does not express itself, the text does not express itself as a Jewish philosophical text would. And obviously, it's very different from poetry, it's very different from prose. So Jewish philosophy is always using philosophical categories, right? And philosophical problems and issues that come specifically for philosophers. And that's, as also the previous slide showed, is a mode of interaction between Jews and non-Jewish culture. Sometimes the interaction is explanatory and it's dialogical, but sometimes it could be polemical. So especially in the Middle Ages, Jewish philosophy engaged quite polemically with the philosophy of the time. Jews had, not just philosophy, but with the culture of the time, namely Christianity, medieval Christianity. Jewish philosophers were quite critical philosophically about Christianity and had to explain themselves in philosophical categories. And finally, today, Jewish philosophy always deals with contemporary issues. So in our generation, of course, the Holocaust will be very important focal point of Jewish philosophy. State of Israel is an important issue that philosophers have to deal with, the issue of power, the issue of justice, the issue of rights. Anti-Semitism would be an issue that Jewish philosophers will have to pay attention to. Feminism and environmentalism, two themes that are very important in my own contemporary work. So they are part of what the Jewish philosopher is going to engage today. But obviously, in previous generations, in previous centuries, the story is somewhat different. So hold on, let me see that. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to go now to say a little bit more about the issue of what is Jewish philosophy, and it's really not simple, and you'll see in a minute there's quite a lot of ambiguity involved in the very definition of Jewish philosophy. So here are these three ways that I put here on this slide kind of enables us to think. Let's begin somewhere. Let's see, how do we define it? So I think the word systematic exposition, or especially the word systematic, is really a good way to start. If I'm going to do philosophy, I have to do it in a systematic way. I have to do it in a particular, almost, I would say, technical way that was defined usually by thinkers outside of the Jewish tradition. So I have to kind of explain what do things mean? What do Jewish beliefs mean? And how to interpret certain issues. But I have to use the categories that was articulated already by other philosophers. And that raises the second thing you see on the slide, namely the attempt to resolve some tensions, conceptual tensions, sometimes problems that arise in the very encounter between philosophy, which claims to be universal, teaches us the truth that applies to all human beings at all times, at all places, versus Judaism, that is a very particular, out of a particular, it relates to a particular group of people, it's a particular set of beliefs. So how do you reconcile the universalism of philosophy with the particularism of Judaism? That was a major issue for Jewish philosophers, and we have many answers to that particular tension. And finally, I would say that Jewish philosophy will always try to figure out the meaning of Jewish existence. In each generation, it's going to be different. So we cannot really generalize about it, but there's something unique about Jewish philosophy that relates to the historical situation in which Jews find themselves. So clearly in the 20th century, the Holocaust has to take center place in this kind of conversation. Same holds true for the creation of the State of Israel. In different generations in the 19th century, it was different. So I won't get into the history of Jewish philosophy right now, but you see, those are three ways in which I can make sense of what is the project of Jewish philosophy. What are they trying to do? So in a sense, they're always trying to explain Judaism to Jews as well as explain Judaism to non-Jews, but also they try to explain to Jews what does it mean to hold a particular belief, or what does it mean to hold a particular position, how to think about God, how to think about the world, how to think about the human being, how to think about death, how to think about happiness. All of those issues are philosophical issues that Jewish philosophers are going to or have dealt with over the centuries. A big problem would be the relationship between philosophy and theology. And there's a lot of ambiguity here. I have to be very honest about it. So I gave you kind of four questions that are really the questions that people always ask about the relationship between philosophy and theology. For example, is Jewish philosophy necessarily religious? That's a very complicated question. I would say in the pre-modern period, the answer is yes. We did not have secular philosophy in the pre-modern period. If this Jewish philosophy was definitely religious, there was no secularity, either for Jews, for non-Jews, for Muslims. It was just simply didn't exist. In the modern period, yes, you can have Jewish philosophy that is not necessarily religious, but even that, I would say that most Jewish philosophers, if not all, are really concerned with a Jewish religious existence. So Jewish philosophy, in some ways, always has to say something about Judaism, and not just about the Jews as a people, as an ethnicity or a group of people, but rather about Judaism as a set of, as a religious tradition, as a way of life, as an approach to life. So Jewish philosophy, I would say, to me at least, yes, you can be, as you can see it, number two, you can engage. There are, especially in Israel, there are philosophers. There are Jews who are philosophers, and they engage in Jewish philosophy. But even then, these people have to figure out, okay, so what am I doing here? Which text I'm engaging in? What are my resources? What enables me to think as a Jewish philosopher? And in terms of the difference between philosophy and theology, I try to give you some way of making sense of that difference. Jewish philosophy begins with the ability to reason. So reasoning, the human ability to reason without help from God, without divine revelation, you can get to truth. So that would be, to me, the point of departure for philosophy. Point of departure for theology will always be the sacred text that is believed to be, at least in Judaism, to be divinely revealed text. So what does the revelation mean? What are the major beliefs of the Jewish tradition? All that is open to interpretation and discussion, but that's what Jewish theologians are doing. And the question is how much overlap there is between philosophy and theology. And I have to say that in the Jewish case, there is considerable overlap. Although not everybody would agree with me on that point. Finally, in terms of what kind of training is necessary to be a Jewish philosopher or a Jewish theologian, or if you wish, a Jewish philosophical theologian, I would say that you have to really have a double body, two kinds of knowledge that you need to be really comfortable with. Now, first of all, the Jewish textual tradition from the Bible, of course, through the Talmud, through Kabbalah, Hasidism, all the way to the present, and then you need to know the Western philosophical tradition. And what the Jewish philosopher does, also the same is true for the Jewish theologian, is some kind of a dialogue between those bodies of knowledge. So you can see, I admit that there is a considerable ambiguity here. There are overlapping terminology. I'm not sure that I can always tell you who is a Jewish philosopher, who is a Jewish theologian. As I said, there's quite a lot of overlap. In Hebrew, we talk about the third category, the Jewish thought, or in Hebrew, Hagut Yehudit. So Jewish thought enables people to do both philosophy and theology, but also to do Jewish ethics. And even Jewish thought also includes what we call Jewish spirituality, or Ruchaniyut Yehudit. So you can see that those terms are, I don't want you to take them too rigidly or too precisely, because there's a lot of gray. Nothing here is black or white. So a big question would be the identity of the person. Who is a Jewish philosopher? And that's actually complicated, because some of the most influential Jewish thinkers in the 20th century, the people I have in mind, Levinas, even Jonas, did not want to be called Jewish philosophers, but they definitely were Jewish philosophers. So there's something problematic about this category, about this phrase. But let's start to unpack some of the possibilities. So does that mean that every philosopher who happens to be, who has some kind of Jewish descent or lineage is a Jewish philosopher? Probably I would say no, and I'll show you some examples. So it's really complicated, but I would say not any philosopher, even though he or she can trace their lineage to a Jew somewhere. It could be even first generation, like the parents. I would necessarily include that person as a Jewish philosopher. Well, how about a born Jew who reflects about Judaism philosophically? I think this is much better approach to kind of who are most Jewish philosophers actually are born, and they reflect about Judaism philosophically. Of course, you can have a person who converts to Judaism and becomes a Jewish philosopher. We have situations like that as well. In terms of kind of the expectation that I have from the Jewish philosopher usually has to explicate Jewish belief. You can't just, to me at least, and not everybody has to agree with that, doing just philosophy with no relevance at all to Jewish experience or Jewish culture. I'm not sure that I will include that person in my list or in my canon of Jewish philosopher. And finally, we have the problem, and I'll say more about it as we go along, the issue of scholarship about Jewish philosophy. So you can be a historian who study the Jewish past, and you're going to write about the history of Jewish philosophy. That person can be a Jew or a non-Jew, and we have many scholars who would fit this fourth category. I'm not sure that that person would define himself or herself necessarily as Jewish philosopher. They would say, yeah, I'm a scholar of Jewish philosophy, but I'm not necessarily a Jewish philosopher. So it's always an issue, kind of who is in and who is not. So here are some examples, and the list could be much longer. Each person on this list, and again, I don't know to what extent people are familiar with these figures, but at least these three are very important, well-known thinkers. So this is Husserl, who is the father of phenomenology, but Husserl converted to Christianity. Unfortunately, had to remember his Jewishness, his Jewish origins, when Heidegger became the chancellor of the University of Freiburg, actually Husserl lost his position at the University of Freiburg. So under certain conditions, here he did not see himself as a Jew, but he was forced to come to terms with his Jewishness when he was expelled from the university, as were other Jews at that time after the rise of Nazism. This is Edith Stein, who was his assistant. She became a nun. Later on, a very interesting phenomenologist, a very interesting deep thinker, but converted to Christianity. Bergson also, and by the also converted, not to Protestantism but to Catholicism. But under the Vichy regime in France, he actually at some point identified, when he was forced to write what he is, to identify himself, he did use the word Jew, but did not write about Judaism. Okay, this is a person who's probably least familiar to people. This is Gillian Rose, a British social philosopher, and very interesting character. She actually wrote about Judaism. She wrote about the Holocaust. She had some complicated positions and rather critical positions of Jewish thinkers who have been writing about the Holocaust. But she converted to Christianity on her deathbed, and she died in 1995. So this is very recent. And this is A.J. Ayres. The Brits always like to just use the first letter of their full name, but the full name is Alfred Jules Ayre. He is from a very distinguished, actually, Jewish family. On the mother's side, the father was not Jewish, was Calvinist, and he's one of the most important analytic philosophers in the first half or the first 2/3 of the 20th century. And he did not write anything about Judaism or didn't engage really Judaism. I myself learned that he was Jewish or Jewish descent rather, only a few years ago. I always knew him as an analytic philosopher. I didn't realize that he's Jewish. So this is kind of a problem. Who is in and who is out? What does it mean to be a Jewish philosopher? Now, if you can say that's another way of looking at Jewish philosophy, you can say that Jewish philosophy is philosophy of Judaism. Okay, so if it's philosophy of Judaism, it matters less who is doing it, but what is being done and how things are done. So philosophy of Judaism means that it's going to be linked to the canonic sources of Judaism. It's going to engage the Western philosophical tradition from antiquity to the present. I just gave you Plato to Heidegger as an overview of that scope. Jewish philosophy always is going to have those characteristics. It's going to be probing, it's going to ask questions, it's going to explicate, it's going to be argumentative, it could be polemical, but there's a certain style of doing Jewish philosophy which is different, let's say, of doing Midrash, or it's different from, of course, Kabbalah or from poetry. But a lot of my work, for example, in the early part of my career, was to show the overlap between philosophy and Kabbalah, especially from the 12th to the 16th centuries, kind of how those ways of thinking about Judaism actually cross-fertilized each other. So this is just to give you a sense that Jewish philosophy is a particular voice within Judaism, and we have to understand it on its own terms. Where do we find Jewish philosophy? In the modern period, Germany, of course, is going to be our major place. Most of the people who created Jewish philosophy in the modern period came from Germany. There's a few also came from the Russian Empire. But the famous ones, Buber, Rosenzweig, Hannah Arendt, Jonas, Strauss, they're all German Jews. France also has, especially after World War II, quite a lot of activity, philosophical activity. The most famous one, even though he was born in the Russian Empire, that's Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas belongs here in France, wrote in French for French audience, but actually he studied in Germany. United States requires a separate discussion. Interestingly, as you know, many of the German Jews ended up as refugees, intellectual refugees who came to the United States in the 30s. So Arendt, Jonas, Strauss, these are all German Jews who actually became very important American Jewish philosophers and shaped really the conversation in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. And of course, Israel, where Either people would come from here, like Joseph Schechter, for example, came from Germany to Israel. He was a very interesting Jewish philosopher, but Israel developed its own cadre of Jewish thinkers, which are quite different from the other centers. So those are places, if you ask me, where's Jewish philosophy done, I would go by that. In terms of what kind of institutions, that's also an interesting thing. Jewish philosophy is done, you can learn and study and teach Jewish philosophy in non-Jewish university and colleges. Obviously, that's what I'm doing at ASU when I give a course on Jewish philosophy. But it's not so simple because most departments of philosophy in the United States are not open to Jewish philosophy. They're not welcoming of Jewish philosophy. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but it happens with a problem, or it happens rarely. So if you ask me, where would the Jewish philosopher teach in a public university? A lot of time it's in religious studies department. Sometimes it's even in the classics department or in a rhetoric department, or, so it's not so simple. How do you teach? Where's the location of Jewish philosophy in the non-Jewish university? Of course, in the 20th century, we have Jewish universities. So we can teach there, places like Bar Ilan University, of course, Tel Aviv University, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, or of Jerusalem, and in the United States, you can teach philosophy in a place like Brandeis, or in Graz College, or in other places that are really focusing on, that are directly Jewish institutions. There's quite a lot of work today also done in various forms of adult Jewish education, especially with the help of the internet. But the model that Rosenzweig created for German Jews from the 20s, the Lehrhaus in Frankfurt became a model for adult Jewish education. So you can study Jewish philosophy in all sorts of levels in those kind of institutions, and of course, finally, in rabbinical seminaries. So this is kind of where you can find Jewish philosophy, but it's not, I think it's fair to say that Jewish philosophy is not nearly as popular as other topics of Jewish culture, whether it's literature or Kabbalah or even art. So I'm very sensitive to the kind of, I wouldn't call it, maybe marginal is too strong a word, but it's not simple to teach Jewish philosophy, and it's not as nearly well known as other topics of Jewish culture. So let's move to part 2 and say a little bit about when does the modern begin and what kind of issues we need to think about. So here are the questions, since I'm talking in the course and in this lecture about modern Jewish philosophy. This is not about Jewish philosophy from antiquity to the present. So we have to ask, well, simple questions. When did the modern period begin? I don't know that there's an agreement on that issue. We should ask, what are the distinctive characteristics of modernity? What makes it modern? Those two questions, of course, are related. What makes a given Jewish thinker, as a modern thinker? For example, can you have somebody in the end of the 19th century still thinking in terms of medieval thought? You can, but it's not going to make that person so modern, right? So what makes a person a modern Jewish thinker? And what are the challenges that modernity posed for Jews? That's probably the most difficult question to answer. We'll try to, I'll give a little bit of discussion of that as we go along. So where does it begin? You can start the story, and I do it in my course. I start the story, I go even a little bit earlier, but minimally we should say that something fundamentally different happened with the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution introduced the democratic principle, which really made Europe change its understanding of the place of the Jew in non-Jewish society. And that's what we mean by emancipation. The emancipation of the Jews from legal disabilities, that began with the French Revolution. The process is more complex. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but the point is that if you're going to think in terms of citizenship, then you have to ask yourself whether the Jews deserve to have citizenship. And the French Revolution basically came up with the right kind of logic that made the emancipation a necessity. But of course, the process was much more complex, because you can decide that the Jews should become citizens, give them emancipation, give them civil rights, but at the same time continue to think about them as people who are not fully human being. And believe it or not, that was a major debate, of course, in the French General Assembly, whether the Jews deserve to be citizens, because are they really fully human being? And if the answer is no, then we shouldn't give it to them, right? So that was a big debate, but of course, that principle prevailed. And we won't get into the historical thing of it, but the principles of the emancipation changed the place of Jews, in some ways brought an end to the ghetto. Again, the story is more complex, but at least that became the impetus for changing the end of ghettoization and the acceptance of Jews into political life as equals. Or you can say, well, no, we should start the modern period with changes in the 19th century, especially with the Industrial Revolution, with the liberal revolutions in the middle of the 19th century, the fact that we now have an open society, and we start seriously with the process of secularization. So maybe that's a better starting point for the modern period. Obviously, you can see that you cannot have this without this. So that's why most people start the modern period even a little bit before, but it all depends of how you want to tell the story. Or finally, you can say, well, maybe we should start the story of the modern only in the let's say World War I, when you have a certain breakdown, a total breakdown of the old world, in a sense. Something really profoundly new starts with the end of World War II. Of course, Zionism is connected with it. The settlement of the Jews in Palestine, that's all part of the story of World War I. So that's another option to start that. I usually start in the 18th century and even go further back to talk about Spinoza, who is 17th century. So because there's no way to think about secularism without saying something about Spinoza. So these are all questions that, of course, historians like to debate. We don't have to, you can choose whatever you feel like is the most appropriate dating that you think. So here's another way of talking about when does modernity begin for Jews. And you can see, if you look at this slide, you can see that the dates of 1870 appears in most of those. So one option is to tell the story that Jews really begin to kind of wrestle with the new world from the 1870s on. And it's not a bad starting point, especially if we think that anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism, really begins in the 1870s. So something really changed by the end of the 19th century that forced Jews to think anew, what does it mean to be Jewish? And I'll get to those questions in a second. So here are some of the forces. I won't get into it. We don't have the time for that, but you're all familiar with that. Forces that shape the modern world, and obviously everything that we take for granted today are product of those kind of forces. And Jews will have to come to terms with the impact of those forces on their life. In terms of characteristics of modernity, so I give you some of the themes that kind of try to capture the modern condition. So clearly scientific rationalism, we can't think about the modern without technoscience. That of course has philosophical foundation to it, but scientific rationalism, secularization, market economy, individualism, liberalism, democracy, and pluralism, to me, those are the things that kind of give the modern period its own distinctive flavor. And each one has a story, each one has a particular history that brought it to be what it is. But I think that if you try to say, okay, so what's unique here? put those factors together and you get the unique flavor of the modern. Now, to be Jewish in the modern period, I would say, is a big conundrum. There are fundamental issues fundamental questions, fundamental issues. Each Jew has to address those issues for him or herself. I summarize it in those three questions. Why be Jewish? There's no, if you can be a citizen and citizenship does not depend on your religious identity, then why are you choosing to be Jewish? Ultimately, it is a matter of choice. So in a sense, all people, whether they're born Jewish or not born Jews, have to decide why, have to grapple with that and make a decision. Yes, I want to identify myself as a Jew, because it's very, as happens to many people, if they don't do anything about being Jewish, within 3-4 generations, that family is not going to remain Jewish. Or it's just a matter of always choosing to be Jewish. There's a subjective dimension here that is necessary. But it's not enough to have a subjective dimension. You also have to decide, okay, so what is Judaism? Or at least what is Judaism for me? What does it mean for me? What do I think? Where do I position myself in terms of the legacy of Judaism that is part of the legacies that I identify with? And once I ask that question, then I have to ask, well, so how am I going to be Jewish? In what way? Is it going to be religious expression? Is it, how do I relate to the texts of Judaism? How do I relate to the practices of Judaism? All of those issues are the biggest challenges, I think, to all modern Jews. And there's just no way around those questions. I really believe that. But we have many responses to those questions. So again, another way of getting to the same kind of dilemmas that I consider part of the challenges of modernity. We're living in an open society. We don't have to be Jewish. If we choose to be Jewish, it's up to us to express it, but it's also up to us to, whatever that means to us. For a lot of people, it meant acculturation on some level. To many people, it also meant, to many Jews, also assimilation. So what is the difference between acculturation and assimilation, and what will happen if a person is very assimilated with no identity as a Jew? Well, what's going to happen in 2, 3, 4 generations? The biggest issue is secularism. That requires another lecture. I would say the relationship between secularism as an ideology and secularization as cultural processes. It's very complex, but in a sense, we are all secular to some extent because we live in the secular world of the open society, and we have to take we have to position ourselves in some ways. On a philosophical level, universalism, especially philosophical universalism, is a challenge, because if I get to the truth through philosophy, why do I need Judaism? What's the point? I don't really need Judaism if I have philosophy. If you don't like the word philosophy, just think about science. Okay, so this problem of universalism, of truth claims that are true to each and every person, no matter where and when, that really raises the question of Judaism, the particularity of Judaism that you have to explain. What's the point here? Historicism is yet another problem. If I can explain everything in Judaism historically, then what about Judaism is beyond history? Is there anything beyond history? Or is it all Jews are just a group of people that have a particular history, and I can explain it without any reference to the belief system of these Jews, or this group of people, this culture? So democracy and pluralism, of course, if we accept the democratic principle, we have to accept also the principle of plurality, and then we are going to get into a lot of disagreements and contentious disputes about what does Judaism mean, to whom and how, and all those issues. And of course, anti-Semitism is the final element that really is. This racial anti-Semitism is unique to the modern period, and it's different from anti-Judaism in previous centuries. So in other words, modernity does not make Jewish life easy. On the contrary, I think that in many ways, it really forces us to think very deeply about all the options that we have and take a stand, and it's not so simple. So, and we know that it's not so simple because we came with all of this, as most people know. all those options here on this slide. These are all ways of being Jewish. These are all responses to the challenges. Each of these, of course, deserves another lecture and another discussion. And they are not in agreement on what does it mean to be Jewish, how to be Jewish, why be Jewish. And we have all those options available to us today, and it's up to us to make sense of it. So in terms of who was the first Jewish philosophers, it depends on where you want to tell this, how you want to tell the story. You can start the story here with Spinoza. That's what I do in the course. Then we go to Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century and try to figure out, okay, what's the difference in the 17th century and the 18th century? And then we go to the 19th century, Hermann Cohen, and say, well, perhaps he should be our first Jewish philosopher. So again, I don't know to what extent people are familiar. I assume that most people are familiar, definitely with Spinoza and Mendelssohn, maybe less so with Hermann Cohen. So in terms of what's modern about Spinoza, the answer here is Spinoza is the first person to really challenge traditional Jewish beliefs. As you all know, Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam. But many of the themes that Spinoza already challenged the community of his day actually are themes or positions or views which are taken for granted by secular Jews today. So if you disagree with Spinoza, or if you cannot really dismiss the story of Spinoza or not bring him to mind if you want to start thinking, okay, so what does it mean to be a modern Jew? So Spinoza could be a way to start the modern story. Because he denied, for example, he denied the divinity of the oral Torah. He also historicized the biblical text. He also identified God with nature. So these are views which today many secular Jews take for granted, but in the 17th century, it was considered a heretical position, and Spinoza was excommunicated. So Spinoza would be a very good topic for a separate lecture. It was so interesting. Another way of starting the story of modernity would be Moses Mendelssohn and the movement of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, and some of the issues. Definitely, Mendelssohn he remained a observant Jew. He did not veer from that, unlike Spinoza. But at the same time, Mendelssohn took a position that may sound odd to us. He denied the authority of the Jewish community to excommunicate. So he actually made it possible for Jews to made it possible for the power of the Jewish community to be diminished by the modern state. So he had a lot to say about the relationship between Jews and the modern state. But that's clearly a modern position which could not have been stated in, let's say, 15th century or the 14th century. And the most important thing is that for Mendelssohn, Judaism is a religion of reasons. Well, how do you explain that? What does that mean? What kind of philosophy do we need in order to make that work? So you can start the story of modernity with the Haskalah, definitely the Haskalah, and Mendelssohn as the father of the Haskalah in some ways could be considered the first Jewish philosopher. Here's an example of this is another approach. We tell the story of modernity from the end of the 19th century, especially if you remember 1870 is a possibility of telling the story there, saying modernity starts in 1870. Well, then Hermann Cohen would be a good place to start because he's the first person to hold a position in a German university. He is a major interpreter of Immanuel Kant's philosophy, and he too continues the notion of Judaism as a religion of reason. So rationality, philosophy, is what Judaism is all about for Hermann Cohen. But Hermann Cohen was a German patriot and really identified with the Germany as a modern nation state. So there's definitely something modern here about him. Toward the end of his life, his identification and his he never veered from being a Jew and identifying himself as a Jew and politically positioning himself against anti-Semitism. But his most Jewish text was written toward the end of his life, not in the beginning of his life. Most of his life were just done philosophy per se. So here are three ways of telling the story of where to start. And these are some books in which you can see how you have to figure out what is the relationship between Judaism and modernity. So each title here, the first books were all written by Michael Meyer, very important historian of modern Judaism. So one is when you talk about response to modernity, then here the focus is just on reform movement as a response to modernity. But here it's a much broader understanding. So the most important thing that I want to bring to your attention is this title, Judaism Within Modernity. We're all modern in some ways, and we're all struggling with the challenges of modernity. And I see that I'm running a little bit out of time. I want to go, maybe I'll go through this more quickly. In terms of kind of, again, the question is the content of Jewish philosophy. I'll go back to this. If I'm going to focus on the content and figure out a little bit deeper who is in and who is out, again, we're going to get some serious issues of kind of ambiguity. Let me just show you. If you look at those figures, so here we are in the 18th century and 19th century. You can see that these people, these are the bottom, those three, Moses Sofer, Chaim Volozhin, Israel Salanter, they are still very traditional looking Jews. These are more modern looking Jews. This is, oops, sorry about that. The first one is Samson Raphael Hirsch, associated with, that's the father of modern Orthodoxy or Neo-Orthodoxy. That's Avraham Geiger, the father of the person who is responsible for Reform Judaism. That's Zacharias Frankel. You can see that modernity, these people look modern. These people do not look modern. So obviously there's an issue kind of, who are these people, and are they philosophers? That's another big question. Or are they just Jewish theologians? However, all these three studied at the university, at the German universities, and they were exposed to philosophy. So I would say that, yes, these are more philosophically oriented theologians than these, but you cannot understand modern thought without mentioning these three. When you go into a sample, if you ask me, okay, so who is on your list? I would say these are the people that I talk about in the course. These are the people that I think will give us a good understanding of the richness and diversity and depth of modern Jewish philosophy. I don't know to what extent the people here on the talk, however many people we have, the 79 people on the talk, how familiar are the people on the talk with those names? But if you ask, oops, sorry about that. Here it is. If you ask me, what do you need to know? I would say that I put 10 people on this slide, and I think that these people are probably the people you need to be familiar with. It doesn't mean that there are no others that could be also part of the conversation, but each one of them takes something really special and tells us something really unique about being Jewish and the meaning of Judaism. And I'll try to summarize some of the insights of each one of them in a second. I have to bring up the issue of Zionism, because Zionism, the people that we've seen here, these people are all people who think about philosophy, but they're in the diaspora. Although the story is more complex, for example, Han Jonas once was a Zionist, Leo Strauss was a Zionist, but neither of them ended up, at least for a long period of time, in Israel. Franz Rosenzweig was anti-Zionist. Hermann Cohen, was anti-Zionist. Buber was a Zionist, a very important one. Levinas, this is Levinas. Also, I wouldn't call him a Zionist, but clearly had a lot to say about a contemporary Jewish life as related to the state of Israel and relationship with Judaism. That's, of course, Soloveitchik, who is also pro-Zionist as an Orthodox Jew. That's Hans Jonas, who was a Zionist, but ended up, a long story, complex story, ends up in the United States. This is Hannah Arendt, a very important political theorist. I wouldn't call her a Zionist. Actually, her relationship with other Zionists, like even Jonas, and of course her close friend Gershom Scholem, became quite complicated after the Eichmann trial that I'm sure you all know about her report about the Eichmann trial. This is Leo Strauss, who was a political Zionist but didn't live in Israel. That's Heschel, also very much pro-Zionist, but I wouldn't call him a Zionist philosopher. And that's Fackenheim, Emil Fackenheim, who ends up actually at a certain point in his life settles in Israel, and his philosophy is tied with being in Israel. So this would be my canon of this modern Jewish philosophy when I teach, as I teach this course. So let's go back to Zionism. Is Zionism a philosophy? I wouldn't say so. I think it's more an ideology. Definitely can use philosophical categories, but it's not systematic as a systematic philosophy. Zionist thinkers were not necessarily trained philosophers, so that's why I hesitate to call Zionism a philosophy, but some people may do so. So in Israel today, there are many philosophers. Many are religious. A good number also can be secular. They're all trained in different philosophical traditions, but they're not necessarily Zionist ideologues anymore, as they were in the beginning of the 20th century. These are people that are included in the Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers. So each one has a particular contribution to Jewish philosophy. Eliezer Schweid is a very important. I can give you quite a lot of discussion about each of them. We don't have the time for it. I just suggest to you that I invite you to know more about philosophy in Israel by looking at those books and by recognizing the richness of intellectual life in Israel, which is quite different from the kind of issues that concern Jews here in the United States. In terms of the scholarship on Jewish philosophy, so if you're a scholar, these are ways of doing scholarship on Jewish philosophy. You have to be trained in the philosophical tradition. You're all a product of what we call the Science of Judaism movement from the 19th century. You're engaged in you have to know the history of Western philosophy. I myself I put myself here, as you know, from the beginning of the lecture. A lot of people who are historians or scholars of Jewish philosophy will find themselves in religious studies, because you can't really deal with those issues unless you engage with categories studies. And some of the people who are scholars of Jewish philosophers are actually trained analytic philosophers, and they're trying to show how Jewish philosophy can be done in an analytic vein. So here are some of the names of the people. These are all friends and colleagues from various places. Michael Moore, it starts from the left. So Michael Morgan, Ken Siskin, Steve Katz, David Schatz, Lior Batnitsky, Lori Zoloth, who was our keynote speaker in the conference in end of February. This is Tamar Udavsky, who's a medievalist, a historian of medieval philosophy. This is Claire Katz, who is a historian of modern philosophy, especially focusing on Levinas. So we have a lot of people who are doing work in Jewish philosophy. Some of them are doing it more constructively, so it's very hard. The constructive Jewish philosophy can be, you can call that person a philosophical theologian or a religious philosopher. So that's where the terminology, as I showed you in the beginning, becomes a little bit more fuzzy. So I won't spend time on that. But clearly, Jewish philosophy today is an academic discipline. People in philosophy are not necessarily in agreement with what I just said. They're not people who would care to know about Jewish philosophy, but Jewish philosophy exists. And Jewish philosophy is an important conversation within Jewish studies, and it can be done in an analytical, historical, and cultural perspectives. These are the places where it can be taught, and these are the bottom are some of the concerns that Jewish philosophers who are scholars of Jewish philosophy are going to engage with. Here are some of the Jewish philosophical theologians or theological or religious philosophers. The people at the top are all people who engaged in the meaning of the Holocaust. The people of the bottom, the four people on the bottom, maybe people know them. This is David Novak, Arthur Green, Elliot Dorff and Rabbi Sachs, who unfortunately just passed away. So each one can be a subject of a conversation, a different lecture, and they're all fascinating and rich and complex and creative thinkers. And but they are much more philosophical, I'll put it this way, they are much more theologically inclined than, let's say, other scholars of Jewish philosophers that I showed you earlier. So in terms of the academic disciplines, I think I'm going to skip that, but you get a sense of there is such a thing called the discipline of Jewish philosophy, and it's part of the humanities. And I want to end by going very quickly into part 4, where we are going to just to say a word or two about the people that I shared with you, the people that I also explicate in the course on Jewish philosophy. So if you ask me kind of what are some of the characteristics of modern Jewish philosophy, here are the things that come to my mind. Relationality, the issue of that we are never separated from what goes on around us, whether it's in terms of other human beings, in terms of the natural world, or in terms of God. It's all about relationality. So Buber, Rosenzweig, Levinas are going to focus on that. The primacy of the ethical, the importance of ethics is also a characteristic of modern Jewish philosophy. It's a major contribution, of course, of Buber and Levinas. The Jewish philosopher, the modern Jewish philosophy is going to be very attentive to particularity, to historical, to the specificity of the Jewish experience, out of which that you can't ignore. That would be one way in which the Jewish philosopher is going to be critical philosophy, because other philosophers could be ignorant or oblivious to the historical, and the Jewish philosopher is going to say, no, we have to pay attention to history. The Jewish philosopher or Jewish philosophy has a kind of, you have to deal with Jewish texts, so you have to engage in an hermeneutical or exegetical activity. You have to you don't have to, but the Jewish philosopher will pay attention to social, political, cultural problems, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's Holocaust, whether it's feminism, whether it's environmentalism. It's all part of the conversation of Jewish philosophy. The Jewish philosopher, the modern Jewish philosopher, always would link the past and the present, and will answer the challenges of being Jewish. So just to kind of whet your appetite a little bit. So Buber would be my best a point of departure, and in October, I will start with Buber, kind of to explain why Buber was so important to grappling with the problem of modernity. Again, we don't have time now, but I can answer questions about each one of them. My next one is Franz Rosenzweig, who was a collaborator and a friend of Buber, but had a very interesting life. Died from Lou Gehrig disease rather young, in his early 40s. He already died from that disease. But he gives us kind of a sense of how to be Jewish, how living Jewish life enables us to be within the particular, but experience the internal in time, experience transcendence through the way of practicing Jewish life. So again, a brilliant, brilliant thinker who really shaped the way we think about the modern Jewish existence. And he deeply, deeply influenced Jewish-Christian relations in the 20th century, the discipline of religious studies, neo-Orthodoxy. Nobody can ignore Rosenzweig. I think Rosenzweig really inspired a lot of people, including the Jewish renewal movement. You can see reference of Rosenzweig in the Jewish renewal movement, even though his life and Jewish renewal is not exactly the same. Levinas, this is Levinas. Again, very influential thinker. If you look at all the aspects of contemporary life that he influenced, but nobody can talk about otherness or alterity without mentioning Levinas. So Levinas is deep, profound. I would love to teach other, in another context about Levinas. As my students know, he's very, very original. This is Fackenheim, who really helped us helped Jews, especially in America, think through the challenges of the Holocaust. I would say that no way in the second half of the 20th century, you cannot think about the Holocaust without thinking about Fackenheim. Fackenheim gave us this famous imperative, do not give Hitler posthumous victory. So Jews have to remain Jewish after the Holocaust in order not to give Hitler posthumous victory. And his philosophy is kind of, it's about history, it's about making sense of the Jewish unique existence, how to do it. He shows us how to do it, a very, very important, original and influential thinker. Soloveitchik, of course, is very known to modern Orthodox Jews. I would say everything in modern Orthodoxy in America is indebted to Soloveitchik, the impact of Soloveitchik, the contribution of Soloveitchik. So central figure. And the reason I find him so interesting is how he works out the relationship between the modern world, the world of technoscience, the major characteristic would be majesty. In his interpretation, it's going to be Adam 1. I won't get into his teachings, but he shows us how you can be in both worlds, in the world of technoscience and modernity and full integration in the society, but at the same time be a person who cares about the covenant and has covenantal relationship and devotes his or her life to study especially the halachic tradition and to function as a halachic Jew. So absolutely central figure. That's Leo Strauss, that also very influential in terms of political theory, political philosophy, and a person who inspired Jewish philosophers to go back to the medieval thinkers and to learn from them how to be Jewish, how to think Jewishly, recognize some of the problems of modernity, the limitations of modernity, especially liberalism, or what he would consider unthinking or vulgar kind of democracy, and how he challenged us to really get deeper into the relationship between philosophy and theology and recognize that they're really separate, they're irreconcilable, but they need to be in conversation with each other. So a very influential thinker. This is Hans Jonas, personally kind of my, oops, I didn't finish this here, but a very important environmental thinker who really taught us that how to deal with and be aware of the challenges of biotechnology or technology in general, but he focused on biotechnology and some of the issues we need to think about. After the Holocaust, we need to figure out how to make sure that life goes on, because we now have the capacity to destroy life, and not only for this generation, but for future generations. So a very important thinker. And this is Hannah Arendt, also known to many, and very controversial figure, but deep, profound thinker who had a lot to say. I love her work on friendship. You can look at her as a philosopher of friendship, and she had a lot of interesting things to say, but also she was very, very controversial and became most influential, especially on the political left. And that's, I'll just add with her that Judith Plaskow, a kind of the major Jewish feminist philosophers who really showed contemporary Jews how you cannot think about Judaism without thinking about women. There's no way to figure out where we are and not take into consideration the female, not just the perspective of the female, the woman, but the body, the human body, including sexuality. You just cannot say that women were not in Sinai, whereas if you read the biblical text, women were actually not supposed to be standing at the bottom of the mountain, right? They were separated from the men. So Judith Plaskow, but in her, that's the title of her book, Standing Against Sinai, kind of forces us to think through the place of women. So here we go. By conclusion, or by way of conclusion, if you ask me why Jewish philosophy matters, these are my answers. Enables us to think systematically about the challenges for Jewish existence. It really forces us to deepen our knowledge of the literary sources of Judaism, challenge us to wrestle with complex theoretical issues, something that we don't do normally because we don't spend time doing this kind of work. And it invites us to raise questions about what we believe, whether it's creation, revelation, redemption. Jewish philosophy takes nothing for granted, always invites us open up, ask questions, probe, clarify ambiguities, and don't be lazy about thinking through what it means to be Jewish. So the bottom line, Jewish philosophy encourages us to go and study. And that's what we're going to do in those 3 final lectures. I may change, I may take out Mordechai Kaplan and do something else, but right now that's the structure that I'm proposing for the 3 lectures in the fall, and invite all of you to join me then. And thank you all for being here and for sharing some of those concerns with me. So first question, very good question. Why is Jewish philosophy rare or frowned upon at non-Jewish universities? Yes, that's a very, very, let me take this down so I can, I'll come back to that, but I'll talk to you without this in front of my eyes. So the issue has to do with the fact that modern philosophy departments are governed, dominated, controlled by the Anglo-American analytic tradition. An analytic tradition in which Jews were very important in the beginning of that tradition in Vienna in the 1920s. But that tradition is very hostile to religion. So the Jewish philosophy, as I explained in this lecture, is too particularistic, too religious, not philosophical enough, and it doesn't do the business of philosophy in the way that analytic philosophers or the tradition of analytic philosophy thinks it should go about. So Jewish philosophy really represents a continental tradition, and between the continental and the analytic, there has been a lot of tension. Just to give an example, I just read recently about Ayer, whom I mentioned, A.J. Ayer, who said that Heidegger is basically a terrible philosopher, a bunch of nonsense. So that kind of dismissive attitude toward the continental philosopher makes it difficult for philosophy that is in a vein, or goes about its business in a vein that is not acceptable to philosophy departments. So that would be my answer to that query. Let's take the question from Lita Ray. I don't know much about philosophy, she says, to begin with, but I've heard of concepts like I think, therefore I am. That's Descartes, yes. Okay, hold on. Okay. And yeah, and she also heard about Descartes or Kant. So do any of these philosophers apply to the Jewish philosophy? So my question, my response to this is these are very important, the non-Jewish thinkers, whether it's Descartes or whether it's Kant or whether it's Nietzsche, these are all very important thinkers that made a huge difference, big difference on Jewish philosophy. So the most important one is Kant. There's no way to think about modern Jewish philosophy without Kant, because think about Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen was the most important, we call him neo-Kantian interpreter. So yes, non-Jewish thinkers are very important to Jewish thinkers. Now the question is, would Jewish thinkers impact the non-Jewish thinkers? Here it's more complicated. So would Jewish philosopher make a difference to Kant? Kant had a lot to say about Jews and Judaism. Not everything is positive, but I wouldn't say that Kantian philosophy requires Jewish philosophy to take place or to happen. Kant could have written his philosophy without any reference to Jews and Judaism. So I hope that helps your question. So it kind of more how Jewish thinkers relate to Jewish philosophers. What do they do with the work? So it's kind of from the outside in, less so the other direction. I hope I've answered your question. Now the question from Avalon, who is my graduate student, and she's in the course, and she's asking, thank you for this lecture. Dr. Samuelson, you have discussed different historical figures, events, and books on Jewish philosophy, but what would you say are the most significant ideas within Jewish philosophy? So yeah, that's very good question. And here, I would say number one, I don't want to reduce Jewish philosophy with its complexity to one, two, three ideas. Okay, so in that sense, I kind of don't accept the basic premise of the question. But on the other hand, I think that if you force me to choose one, I would say the issue of relationality. That's, of course, a Buberian answer I'm giving you. The fact that we are always relational, that would be a very important theme and significant idea in Jewish philosophy, definitely in the modern period. Now, if I would give you a theological answer, so then it's simple. I can say there are three main ideas in Judaism: creation, revelation, redemption. So every Jewish philosopher will have to deal with what does creation mean, what does revelation mean, and what could redemption mean, and how do they come about? What is I mean, all of Jewish philosophy is going to revolve around those three. So you can choose which answer do you prefer, just to say, I need to speak about relationality as what Jews, in a sense, actually, let me suggest that you can actually combine the focus on relationality and the three beliefs that I mentioned: creation, revelation, redemption. They're all about relationality. And that's Rosenzweig's insight. If you're going to focus on, the Jewish is always about relationship, the relationship of God and the world, that's creation, the relationship God and the human, that's revelation, and the relationship of human to the world, that's redemption. So in a sense, if you force me to give you a more kind of precise answer or more reductionistic answer, that's the answer I would give. And I hope that helps. Now let's see here. Aaron Moskowitz asks, how does Jewish intellectual life in Israel differ from that in the United States? Now that's very good question. Um, I, on some level, I don't want to exaggerate the separation between what's going on in Israel, what's going on in the United States. Obviously, not today in the world that we live in, with the kind of communication system that we have. We're not living two worlds apart. But there's more, I would say, in the United States, if I can think about, in the United States, it's more about Judaism. In Israel, it has to do more with Jews, with issues that has to do with Jewish life. In the United States, I think it's more about Judaism. I think on the whole, I think that probably gets there. But again, I can challenge what I just said. I can actually qualify it or come up with some a little bit differently. But in any case, it's different. Another way of answering your question, Aaron, would be this. It's different when everybody speaks Hebrew, reads the Hebrew text, and has access to the sources in a way that in the United States, since most Jews actually do not know Hebrew, do not master Hebrew, their relationship to the sources of Judaism, which are written in Hebrew, is going to be very different from what it is in Israel. That doesn't mean that everybody in Israel is philosophically inclined. I definitely don't mean that, but I do mean that we are in a different environment because of the language difference. I think that's fair to say. Now, Gerald Weiner is saying, a very difficult subject. How does my Jewish philosophy differ from my Christian neighbor on a day-to-day social interaction? Very good question. Okay, so I can only answer that. Well, it's another way. What you're asking is, is there a difference between being Jewish and being Christians? And I would say, yes, there is. Okay, so I think On that level, there's a certain set of beliefs that Christians, those who define themselves as Christians, have that a person as a Jew will not hold those beliefs. Of course, Jesus, Jesus as Christ would be the main difference. So on a day-to-day level, there's on day-to-day interaction, no, there's no difference. You can be very close friends of a Christian, and the difference in opinions or the difference in belief system is not going to make a difference on the day-to-day social interaction. On the contrary, it may be even contribute to the relationship. So sometimes you will have less contentions or less contention or less tension with a Christian friend than you would have with a Jewish friend who doesn't hold you the same views. Okay, so I think on that level, I don't see. But I think that what you do have to take seriously is that Christianity has its own history of philosophy and its own. You have to understand its development over time. There's no way to talk about Christianity without knowing something about philosophy. So by the same token, I would say there's no way to really fully understand Judaism without dealing with Jewish philosophy. So it has nothing to do, I don't think that it has to impact the relationship between people. But on a philosophical level, yes, there are differences. There's a big difference if you believe in Jesus as Christ or if you don't believe in Jesus as Christ. Is the world redeemed or not redeemed? If you're Jewish, then the answer is no.
You said racism started in the 1889s. Was the Inquisition not racism? Were the earlier pogroms not racism?
Okay, racism actually, racial anti-Semitism started in 1870s, not 1889. But the Inquisition is a very complex institution. I assume you are talking about the Spanish Inquisition, which was created in 1478, as opposed to the Papal Inquisition, which was created in 1236. So those are two separate institutions, although they, of course, have a history of relationship between the two. As for the pogroms, whether the pogroms is a Russian word, of course, and the pogrom is we use it today to talk about any kind of anti-Jewish riots, but it really should be used more narrowly to physical attacks on Jews. Now, are they expression of racism? Well, that's complicated. It definitely the pogroms against the Jews, especially in 1881 in Russia, and then 1903, 1905. So those attacks on Russian Jews, was there a level of racist animosity there? Yes, I think it's fair to say, but it's no less important to talk about it as expression of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which has other no also religious rather than just racial. So modernity, I agree with the gist of this question, that in modernity, the racial and the religious, the animosity against Judaism and the animosity against Jews, that is going to be combined in the modern period. Therefore, in many ways, it's ironic to say, but it's more difficult to be Jewish in the modern period than it was even in the pre-modern period. Even though Jews, the life of Jews were also had its own challenges in the pre-modern period. So I hope I answered, Carol, I answered your questions, but there's definitely hatred of Jews, whether it's on the basis of race with the kind of ideology of racism, or whether it's hatred of Jews on religious basis. Both of them are working together. With the Inquisition, it's a whole different. It's not different. It's a different story. So we understood on its own terms, and it's how it evolved, what was going on in Spain in the late 14th century after the mass conversion of Jews to Christianity in 1391. So let's put it for another lecture. Oh yeah. So I hope everybody that you got a taste a little bit of why Jewish philosophy matters, how we need to take it seriously. I really invite you to not to be afraid of philosophy and to kind of, of course, go to lectures on Jewish philosophy wherever they are offered, and from, online or not online. And there's so much to know. There's so much depth and so much creativity that I think we kind of do ourselves a disservice when we don't avail ourselves to this literature. And I also agree that this is not easy literature. You cannot do Jewish philosophy for dummies. Everybody knows that kind of series, right? Of some so and so or such and such for dummies. No, you can't do it with Jewish philosophy. Jewish philosophy is difficult, but it's also good that it's difficult because it invites us to penetrate and to think through and to go deeper.